It is November 16th. I am about a week late on getting out the recordings that I meant to get done. A lot of stuff crop up on a personal level, but I'm back at it and electrical tape in my pockets. Just doing stuff. What's the conversation today that I'm talking about is the demonization of China in the West. And demonization is a very strong word, and I don't use it lightly. But looking at historical events, looking at current events, looking at the language that's used, especially not so much in the media per se, though the subjects that they use are pretty shitty, but the language that I see online is terrifying. It's very horrid, and a lot of very racist language is used. Yeah, any social media that you look at, be it Reddit or Facebook, YouTube, or what have you, there's a lot of especially in the past like 6 months, there's a lot of really bad language that's been cropping up surrounding China. They just had their first the first citizen from the PRC is he's a Formula F1 driver. So he's a race car driver in Formula F1. I don't really watch it. I've seen it before. It's cool. But it's predominantly like a American, European, more European, I guess, sport with racing. So you got a lot of Europeans that are generally, and I don't know what other people they've had in it internationally. I know there's been obviously American drivers, but so the first, I don't know if he's the first Chinese, like ethnically, like Han or whatever, but he's the first person from PLA or PRC, like wording. And so the rhetoric on there is just it's horrible anti-Chinese shit all over the place, and then like in a place like that where it's like, why the fuck does that matter? Like why would you have to say some shit like that? And it goes back to a lot of the other stuff that we see in the modern era, like the social credit score meme or whatever that's going around, which is, I mean, oh, you negative 1,000 social credit, this is bad for your social credit score, and that's been around for a few years, which is stupid when it comes from Americans, because I have a credit score in the United States. That's not abnormal. I mean, it's astrology for economists, but it's stupid. But I mean, that's not like, oh, you're going to talk about a social credit thing, which I mean, it sounds like bullshit to me. Like it doesn't exist. It just seems like something that somebody came up with because they thought it was a funny thing to talk about the authoritarian, oppressive Chinese and their horrible communist government. It's just a stupid meme. So that's what I'm discussing today. That's what I've written my transcript out here about, which is more of an essay. It's like I don't know how many thousands of words. Oh God, it's like 10 pages. Yeah. So that's what I'm discussing. So mostly, so it's on the what I'm going to call like a xenophobic propaganda campaign that I've seen crop up. And so this isn't necessarily, I mean, it's obviously it's directed by the United States government, right? I don't, if you disagree with that, I mean, you can look at history to see that the United States has, and I'm going to explain it, has a long history of directing these sorts of propaganda campaigns against China, but also against everybody else on the planet. I don't think there's a group that's safe from directed propaganda from the United States government. They've been very adamant about pressing that sort of stuff. But so that propaganda gets pressed out and filtered out through the news media, and there's not like there's a safe media in the United States that doesn't press this sort of propaganda. It's pressed everywhere, and it's pressed primarily to demonize and otherwise a rival state, which China is very much a rival to the United States. But it's also done out of an anti-communist rhetoric in the United States. It fits perfectly in that scheme as China's the most successful, I would say, the most successful socialist state we've seen so far. Like considering, and I'm going to explain it, but considering everything that's going on, like they're pretty fucking successful at what they've been doing and the way they've been doing it. And you can argue, oh, they're state couples. I don't care about your argument. Your argument's stupid. They're a socialist state. They're an actually existing socialist state. They're the best example of it. The Chinese Communist Party is the head of the international communist movement. They did that. They built the largest largest social state in human history, and they're moving towards communism eventually. I don't know how long it'll take. I don't think anybody does, but that's who they are, and that's why the United States government is so adamant about pushing rhetoric against them, because they are an existential threat to the capitalist system, which they want to protect. That's what the United States government exists to do, to protect the capitalist system. I'm gonna take a big sip and then we're gonna go. So this subject has been obviously quite the lightning rod over the past few months, and really for the past few years. The rise of China's economy over my lifetime has been meteoric and has rightfully struck fear into the heart of the Western Empire. And Western Empire are referred to collectively as the NATO, as well as associated states throughout the Pacific and throughout the world that are aligned with the United States. It's a Western empire. I view it as a big cohesive thing, though it's more of a decentralized state that encompasses the extent of our political military reach, or the American hegemonic is a good word. I'm gonna write that one down. That's a good word. Hegemonic system. So that empire isn't one that has always been preeminent on the world stage, despite what standard history course might relate. Okay, certainly they've had quite the impact on the global stage over the past half millennia. However, that has not always been the case. Europe, and by extension North America, taking the throne of the empire and becoming the core of the empire, has not always affected the entirety of human history. You're going to read about the Roman Empire and Carolingians and all this shit, but that doesn't mean they were the center of the world, right? The Roman Empire existed at a time where equally expansive and powerful empires existed, both in Africa and in Asia. It's not a century polar world. It didn't all come out of fucking Athens and into Rome, right? Like that's not the start of human history. Now, if you have a history course in the United States, they're going to paint it like that. I mean, I'm making a blanket statement. Okay, that's not fair. I've known plenty of history professors. I've had several history professors who had a much more cosmopolitan view about things. But generally, especially in like a high school history course, you're going to get a kind of a regurgitated line about all this sort of stuff, and it's not accurate. It gives you kind of a blanket of human history, but the past 500 years, it's very much been our thing. Over several thousands of years, China's rich history has seen their society exist as a heavy counterbalance across the Afro-Eurasian landmass when compared to the closest equivalent in the Roman Empire and the successor kingdoms of Christianity. This episode won't, of course, be covering the entirety of the history of either of these cultures, not because it isn't relevant to the discussion, but simply because it's outside the scope of my discussion here. And yeah, like I was saying, it's you get a whole degree on studying the subject that I'm trying to boil down into like 10 pages, right? So China is resurgent, thanks no small part to the success of socialism in bringing their society out of the darkness of massive civil strife, colonial interference, and direct occupation and resistance to a genocidal campaign of destruction. This resurgence is something that the West has feared for centuries. It means a global change in the balance of power. What we're seeing in online discourse, in the media, and in most perceptions that people are coming to are a result of a two-pronged approach by the capitalist system. There's an inherent bias towards anything that comes out of China, and a targeted propaganda campaign with the purpose of making them out to be a monstrous entity. And where does this inherent bias towards anything Chinese come from? And to understand that, I'm going to go over the past few centuries of history in China, and I'm going to try and be brief about it. But I mean, because yeah, again, I'm boiling down something you could get an entire master's degree in just a pretty short summary. But the past 200 years, 300 years, have been really specifically important to where the global bases of power are and how they're competing with one another. The rapid expansion of colonial projects across the globe would eventually bring many different European powers into forceful confrontations with Chinese society. The Qing dynasty, established in the mid-17th century, had seen the height of their power a century later during the 1700s, the 18th century. I hate that the way we do that, but Another whole nother episode. So coming to control most of the territory associated in modern day China. This is the Qing Empire was really expanding during this period, as well as most of modern Mongolia they had under control at the time. But this is when they were expanding out west into the areas of like Xinjiang and all this. So the unity and power of this dynasty would begin to unravel in the 19th century rather rapidly due to a variety of reasons. Primarily a massive economic downturn coincided with a population boom. Their economy is taking a shit while the population is going up. Usually you want it to go the other way. At least, well, you want them to kind of be in line. You don't ever want the economy to downturn, but this is what happens. Boom and bust cycles. It's capitalism. So it made their territories ripe for foreign intervention. And this intervention came first in the forms of these opium wars. So for millennia, trade had blossomed along the Silk Road and the various trading routes out of China, across Central Asia and into the Middle East and eventually Europe. This trade had, for the most part, been mutually beneficial over the centuries. Europeans were getting goods that they wanted, China was getting goods that they wanted. Everybody in between was making lots of money. Everybody was happy. Well, not everybody was happy, but and the elites in every part of the world were happy. It was a good thing. So it brought interconnectedness to the world. I'm not going to say it's a bad thing. I mean, you saw it really flourish under the Mongol Empire, and the Mongol Empire, and by extension the Yuan dynasty, like they did horrible genocidal campaigns of their own, but brought interconnectedness to the world and brought everybody into connection with everybody. You had a trade of ideas in addition to all sorts of goods and materials and everything. It was a period of prosperity for the world, I'll say. I don't want to necessarily say it was good, but yeah, that's a whole nother thing. So the colonial endeavors of Europe would see their markets consuming more and more and more, and both in terms of goods directly, but also in terrain, materials, and people. And this is within their own society as they transition out of a like feudal serfdom and into more like mercantile capitalism and expanding, building this wage labor. And this all comes out of, driving up of wages as the worker base fell down, coming out of the Black Plague and the Little Ice Age and all this stuff. The massive dying off of population. A third of Europe died. And again, basically, if you know this stuff, you know this stuff. If not, that's kind of what drove that engine to kind of propel people into expanding out like this and expanding into the age of exploration and whatnot. So the Portuguese expeditions around the Cape of Good Hope saw sea routes opening up with China during the 15th century, while the colonization of Americas also saw these routes across the Pacific, further connecting the world in trade and transit. So you're seeing this kind of growing network of people moving and ideas moving and colonization occurring. It was not an even spread. Okay. So one of the prime methods that colonial powers have used throughout the history in an effort to destabilize their victims and to further spread discord is with the use of intoxicants, drugs, or other disabling means. So alcohol in the Native American populations are one of the better examples that comes to mind. And I had a major blind spot on this, and I had to correct it because I had a view that wasn't correct. But so alcohol in Native American population is one of the better examples. So the introduction of liquor and specifically in getting Native peoples already victims of plagues and mass genocides to begin with, addicted to the substance, which they were using, as a way to cope with the horrors of the existence that they were suddenly thrust into. It was used as a way to break up, demean, and basically make vulnerable their peoples. And so pervasive was this method that even this racist false myths of native inability to handle alcohol exist to this day. That native people can handle alcohol just as well as anybody else. There's no predilection to, like, alcoholism is a genetic thing, but it doesn't occur with any more greater occurrence amongst their populations than does amongst white, African American, Hispanic, whatever Asian populations. Everybody's equally vulnerable to it. But so this myth occurred of the natives, they can't handle their liquor and fire, water, yada yada, all this racist shit. And that myth, it exists in Native communities as well. And so a lot of Native young men turn to alcohol because they don't think they'd be able to handle it in the first place, and they figure they might as well get it over with. And I am, again, generalizing, but that's a myth that's existed within their community. And so this is used as a way of breaking up their people and preventing them from being unified and preventing a strong front of resistance as they break down, their societies are colonized and pushed out, and their homes are destroyed. And so this practice was also used in China, although the intoxicant wasn't alcohol. In this case, it was opium. So opium, which comes from those red poppy plants, made a lot of them in Afghanistan for some reason. Well, they still do. It grows well there. But so in Afghanistan, being a bordering nation of China, even at that time, at that period, opium had long been used in China. They weren't a stranger to the drug. It wasn't something new to them. Ever since the 7th century Tang Dynasty, or was it 8th century? The 700s, right? I don't remember exactly when the Tang Dynasty started or ended. I know it was from like the 6 to 900s around that period. So, but during that period, it was used as a medical narcotic, much in the same way that opiates are used in the modern era as medical narcotics. And it was used to treat a variety of ailments, just as it is in most cultures. By the end of the Ming Dynasty in the 1600s, Portuguese traders were regularly trafficking opium into China, its trade being nearly as lucrative as the export of tea from China. So the usage of opium had changed, with it now being smoked recreationally. And as they were introducing it into societies, they were just, there wasn't anything against it. They were just pumping it out. And so the importation of opium would see several Qing Dynasty emperors, who the Qing Dynasty would crop up after the fall of the Ming Dynasty. They would outlaw its use, and they were correctly recognizing the harmful effects of the unrestricted spread of the drug in their society. Opium's not an inherently bad thing, I would say. I mean, I don't think any drugs are inherently bad when they're used for their appropriate intentions. When they're used outside of that, obviously they become bad things. They are used to bad means. So their outlawing of the drug and issuing edicts and attempts to cut off its importation were not effective. By the early 19th century, the drug was being used to a great extent within every major Chinese city, particularly in the south, where it had flowed overland through a poorly enforced border, and through the ports in cities such as Hong Kong, Macau, and Shanghai, where European traders imported thousands of tons of it every year. And you look up, if I can find them, I'm going to post them on the video, so ignore what I'm saying right now. It'll be the picture. But you can see just there's sketches and images of these just towers of crates of opium, and they'll have these like massive 10-story towers of little dock workers and chevadors running around on the ground, like just of massive amounts of this drug being imported into China. And it's just absolutely insane. It's like the 1980s and crack all over again. Just the government importing all this fucking shit for people. So while the drug itself was making millions of members of China's working class into morose, unreliable workers in cities, it had an additional effect of seeing vast quantities of China's silver currency shipped out of the country. They were paying it to the traders, straight silver, because that's what their currency was at the time. And so all this wealth, all this capital was leaving China. It was very detrimental for their economy. And so these effects caused a backlash from the Chinese emperor, who ordered over 1,000 tons of confiscated opium destroyed, sparking a conflict with British importers. And the superiority of the British naval weaponry saw the Chinese capitulating in the face of several defeats over the next few years. And this was in the I should have put a date on here. It was in the 1840s during the First Opium War. So the defeat in the First Opium War lost Hong Kong. However, that's when Hong Kong, I believe it. So it was either the first or second one where it was, like the first one, like it came under like total British control. And I think the second one's where they put in the whole treaty where they would have it for a century and a half or 2 centuries or whatever. So either way, the lack of improvement in trade relations, because why the fuck would the Chinese want to improve those relations with an imperial power that's actively colonizing them? Like, and some would just try and lessen the struggle, but like at that point, you're like, man, fuck off. All right. That was the mentality anyways. And it led to the Second Opium War a decade later in the 1850s. Now, the second conflict followed a similar path and ended in a similar manner, with more territory being ceded away, with Beijing under occupation of foreign colonial forces, and opium being forcefully legalized. So they took over Beijing and they made it to where, like, no, you're going to smoke this. Okay, we're forcing it in there. Britain entered the war on drugs on the side of drugs, and they brought it in there and forced it onto these people. And so this was obviously a bad period for the Qing dynasty. They couldn't protect their own. They couldn't protect their own, their own ground. They couldn't hold the Forbidden City itself. And so this severely weakened Qing dynasty would stumble forward for the next several decades, with a variety of internal conflicts and revolts stemming from attempts to reform and modernize, leading to the deaths of tens of millions, famines, and a lost war with Japan that would see the seeds of the Second World War laid in Asia. The collapse of the Qing dynasty by 1911 sparked a new era in the history of China. So the collapse of the dynasty, this was a I mean, this was unheard of territory for a society that had dynasties, like successive dynasties, even while under occupation, like say during the Yuan dynasty, they were successive like Chinese dynasties of monarchical rule going back thousands of years. And this ended in 1911. So the 1911 Xinhai Revolution was one of the first major societal changes that would occur in the transformative 20th century in China. The transformation from feudal colonized society to bourgeois democratic republic, in a process not too dissimilar to the bourgeois democratic revolutions in France and America, would see the first of many revolutionaries, Sun Yat-sen, ushered into power. A man idolized both by the Communist Party of China, who would originate during this period as well, with inspiration from their comrade Bolsheviks in the Soviet Union, as well as the Kuomintang. Sun Yat-sen set China on a path of rebuilding their shattered country. Shortly after the success of the revolution, however, Sun Yat-sen would pass away in 1925 due to cancer, sparking a power struggle that saw the nascent republic once again ripped apart by war. The ensuing period saw various warlords crop up in China, as well as a conflict between the growing CCP and the KMT, it's the Chinese Communist Party, and the Kuomintang. In the midst of civil war, the expansionist Imperial Japan flushed with nationalistic spirit, and this is due to a variety of victories that they had secured, both in the First Sino-Japanese War in 1898, as well as their victory over Russia in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. They kicked in the teeth of their largest neighbor in China, and then they took a European power, the Russian Navy, made them drive their navy all the way around the world, and then they sunk the motherfuckers. Okay, they were fucking on the rise, and Japan was going through a similar opening up period, and they were going in a very different direction. So they took advantage of the situation. They launched an invasion of Manchuria from their holdings in Korea, which was secured during the end of the 19th century. This invasion saw a variety of small incidents between the different Chinese armies and the Japanese, and it escalated to the point of all-out war in 1937 with the start of the actual Second Sino-Japanese War. So the Mukden Bridge incident happened in 1932, and that's what sparked their conquest of Manchuria. And then the Marco Polo Bridge incident happened in 1937. That's what sparked their actual invasion of the rest of China, away from just Manchuria. So the war was a very formative moment for China and what we know of the modern Chinese society. This war was the start of a new period. The horrendous atrocities that were committed by the Imperial Japanese forces were a lightning rod for the Chinese people, and it saw CCP and KMT forces united once again in the face of a common enemy. And nothing unites a people better than having a massive, overarching threat. It's what united the Soviet peoples in the wake of the Russian Civil War, is constantly having all these outside attacks coming in and allowed everybody to consolidate, because they have to consolidate and hold together, or else you're going to get ripped apart by the capitalist powers. A similar thing's happening in China, though they're not. No, it's not so much being focused on by capitalist powers, because the Communist Party doesn't have all that much power, but the capitalist powers are still trying to rip it apart and pull the different pieces out. And so when something very direct, like an invasive imperial fascist force, like say the Japanese or say the Germans, comes in, it's a unifying moment. Everybody bands together. You see a lot of kinsmanship and comradeship as people say, okay, we may not agree on everything, but we've got a very distinct something to focus on. And that distinct something was the Imperial Japanese Army. I cannot understate the butchery and the horrors committed by the Imperial Japanese Army. Like, they were a uniquely brutal fighting force. I would dare say I mean, a lot of people want to focus on the actions of the Wehrmacht, but I would say the actions of the IGA, equaled them. There was something on the order of 20 or 25 million victims in Eastern Europe over the course of the war there. There was something on the order of 15 to 20 million victims throughout China as well during the same period. And it gets glossed over a lot in history, and it shouldn't, because it was, I mean, just as much as Germany lost the war because they decided to fuck with the Soviet Union, Japan lost the war because they tried to fuck with China the way they did. Okay. So, and the relative performance of the armies against the IGA IJA. I've been saying IGA, haven't I? They've been fighting a grocery store, kicking its ass. Their qualitative actions against the Japanese army would serve as a preview of the events that would follow the conclusion of the war. Now, the communist forces generally performed very well against the imperial invaders. Okay, they scored many victories over the Japanese, whereas the Kuomintang forces generally performed with much less success. They They had a very different way of fighting, a very different way of how they dealt with the people, and this kind of had to do with their methodologies on how they were conducting their wars prior. The KMT were very authoritative and very repressive of the peasant population even before the Japanese invaded, whereas the Communist Party, as part of Mao Zedong's like strategy on guerrilla warfare, was in gaining the trust and the respect of the peasant population and trying to form them into a mass movement. And to do this, your guerrillas have to be like nice to the population. People are going to want to fight with you, fight alongside you, if you treat them like shit and you're burning down their stuff and you're conscripting their young men, which is what the KMT was doing. The guerrillas and the communist forces did it to a lesser extent, and they did it much more in a way of trying to actually protect and help people. And so through this, they had better unity, better morale, better tactics, and they fought against the Japanese army much better. And so with the I'm getting mixed up. I'm still working on writing these out, so I'm going off on tangents constantly. But so these successes, they drew in the masses into support of the CCP, who under Mao Zedong's leadership were quickly becoming the dominant force in China. With the defeat of the Japanese, war once again resumed between the two forces. The CCP, who had been nearly defeated 2 decades prior by the KMT in 1927, and this was where they started the Long March, and they were almost all killed, and it was a really low point for the communist movement in China. They were bolstered by several decades of conflict and experience, and they were one of the largest and most effective fighting forces on the world by this point. So the fighting from 1946 to 1949 saw the KMT forces, the official recipients of US and UN backing, defeated and forced to retreat to Taiwan. Communist China, born in 1921, was finally realized as a cohesive United State. And fun fact, so when UN forces, the US forces were invading North Korea, when they reached the Yalu River and they were finally engaged by Chinese forces who came across to push back this invading capitalist army. So US forces would actually come up against Chinese forces carrying like Thompson submachine guns and M1 Garands and stuff. And these were guns that we had given to the KMT, 7-8 years prior, who turned around and they had to turn them over to the communists as they fled, and the communists are using whatever weapons they could get. And so we had a whole bunch of them running, and the United States Army stopped using Thompson submachine guns in 1948. They removed them all from their stocks and armories. So it was funny. You had Americans who didn't have access to these things going up against their former weaponry like that. Which is a repeating case that we'll see multiple times throughout history. Just about every war we've had, we go up against people using our own guns. Weird how that works. So the Cold War saw this wax and wane in relations between China and the West. Okay, so like I said, right after their creation, a year later, they're going to war against the West, but it kind of pulls back from that a little bit. And this, we'll see why. Their imperial shackles had long since been discarded. China was a force to be reckoned with under communist rule. They blunted pushback and forced the United States to accept their conditions on the Korean Peninsula by 1953, carrying on the tradition of halting imperialist aggression on the continent that began with their defeat of Japan. They rapidly modernized their country over the ensuing decades. They doubled their life expectancy between 1930 and 1960, and they had 2 very destructive wars during this period, and they still managed to do that. They nearly doubled their population between 1949 and 1980, again, with a couple of wars in the process and a couple of very major societal shifts in the process. Their population sits currently at over 1.4 billion, of which they've reduced the poverty rate from 88% in 1988 to just 0.7% in 2015. Now, a lot of that's from growing pains and figuring out how they're running their country, having internal power struggles. I mean, they weren't a perfect communist state. They weren't a perfect socialist state from the start. I don't think and that's a fault that people find with socialist states, that, well, they're not perfect. They have all these problems. Like, yeah, they have problems because they're a society of people. And they're trying to build a better society compared to what they had before. And what they had before, I don't think anybody would want to live in 1920s China. I don't think anybody would want to live in 1800s China of any fucking part of it. Compared to what they had then, they've increased incredibly. So, so that poverty rate reduction from 88% in 1988 to just 0.7% in 2015, even less now, that line can't be restated enough. Their population in 1988 was 1.1 billion. They've added 300 million people since then, an equivalent of an entire extra United States worth of people. The United States population, 330 million. We're now 1 in 5 compared to the Chinese population. Okay, so they did so while lifting the vast majority of their entire population, a significant percentage of the entirety of the human race, out of poverty. And now plenty of people, communists and capitalists alike, are going to bicker and debate about whether or not a socialism, state capitalism did this, who gets credit, who gets playing, yada, yada. So one might try and point out that they're not true communists or whatever. And one might also point out that nations who had similar revolutions, similar times, such as Cuba and North Korea, were isolated, devastated, and made pariahs in the world community. An inability to adapt to the materialist conditions of the world in order to press communist ideals forward makes for an awfully shitty socialist society. That's not to say that Cuba and North Korea are shitty. Cuba is definitely not a shitty place to live. North Korea is very much a victim of circumstances, in my opinion. However, having had such a dogmatic approach to communism puts one at a distinct disadvantage. An inability to understand the conditions of the world you live in and understand that you are an island of socialism in a communist or a capitalist world, you have to at least open up a little bit and work with them a little bit. Otherwise, they're going to, I mean, look at North Korea. Look at what has either been forced upon them or they've been forced to do. You know, whether you believe the propaganda about them or not, whether you believe the stories come out of there or not, what's happening there has not been an ideal situation in the past since their formation. Okay, it's not been a good time. And that herein lies the origins of the anti-communist rhetoric that has existed for China since 1921 and is seeing quite a resurgence today. Okay, all this stuff I stated about the population growth and the poverty reduction, okay, whether you believe that or not, somebody believes it, and that somebody's the United States government. They see what's happening there. The capitalist establishment sees what's happening there. They see their exploitative means that they were using for a long period in China being stripped away from them. The tools that they were using are stripped away. Anti-communist rhetoric first saw widespread usage in the United States during the immediate aftermath of the Russian Revolution, during the first Red Scare in 1920. The rapid industrialization of the Soviet Union, the unity of its workers, and the eradication of class disparity and poverty are all things that are very much feared in capitalist societies, whether they'll admit it or not. The destruction of the social stratification inherent in capitalism, which was inherent in feudalism before, at its base level is something that capitalism cannot withstand. It's a basic goal of communist ideology. That base fact is why, in the heart of the capitalist empire, anti-communist propaganda abounds, obviously. This rhetoric has existed as long as communism has existed as an ideology. It saw itself manifested against China specifically during the Korean War as the PLA intervened to assist the KPA in pushing the United States back south of the 38th parallel. PLA is People's Liberation Army, obviously. KPA is the Korean People's Army, the Army of North Korea. Indeed, the hatred, fear, and animosity towards Chinese people began much earlier than that. So Chinese immigration in the United States began in the early 19th century, just as the Qing dynasty was beginning its downward spiral. Economic strife had driven small numbers of traders. However, by the middle of the century, there were hundreds of thousands, and by the 1880s and the introduction of the Chinese Exclusion Act, there were millions of them in the United States. They came for a variety of reasons, and it was generally for economic. The abolition of slavery in the United States and the industrialization of the westward expansion of the North American continent, there arose a need for laborers, a high need. Formerly enslaved persons did work the railroads, but like the rest of the Americas, Chinese laborers were contracted and brought to the Americas were brought to North America to work difficult manual labor jobs. And this is a phenomenon that happened all across the Americas, throughout all the former colonies that existed there. The Chinese laborers came across the entire Western Hemisphere, and it's another one of those untold stories of movements of people. So they were usually men, though, and their ages were from the early teens into the early 30s. The laborers were very quickly demonized as being unable to assimilate with settler colonial culture. They didn't speak the language. They didn't speak anything that was even close to the language. Mandarin and English are pretty fucking disparate languages. Ask anybody that speaks the two together. Like it's doable. Don't get me wrong. There's people that can speak both of them flawlessly together, but it's a hard bridge to gap, or it's a hard gap to bridge. So labels, they were demonized because they were unable to assimilate with the settler colonial culture, and propaganda began to arise against their success with the gold rush. There were not only impoverished laborers, but there were wealthy Chinese that came over as well, and they contributed to small pioneer towns in ways that are very similar to today's stereotypes: food, clothing, medicine, banking, etc. And while scaring whites during westward expansion, they were seen as dangerous. They were also targeted for opium related rhetoric here as well. This is at the height of the opium wars, and just in the aftermath of it, it became a really common stereotype. And so the US, they of course wanted more white settlers, but less settlers of other origins. Ingus is the exception to the white settler rule. Everybody wants an Ingus, right? Look at this little kitty cat. All right, go on, buddy. And so this proved to be difficult. Okay, since there much promise was given to white settlers who came for land and might not have been as willing to sell their labor to industries that would potentially kill them. Capital in the West required cheap or unpaid labor, which was no longer as feasible since the abolition of chattel slavery. Starving wages were a heavy compromise and not always made good. For a laborer was accused of any sort of criminal activity, they'd be hanged without trial, murdered, unpaid, or years were added to their contracts. It became a matter of survival, and their hopes to uplift their families at home for the promise of gold was not fulfilled. The Chinese settlers, Chinese immigrants who were largely from the Fujian province were promised certain wages, and they were not paid as what was promised. They were kept in perpetual poverty and trapped within their labors. Many were unable to pay for their voyage home. Without representation, without a collective voice, they were thrown into harsh conditions reminiscent of what happened in early colonial Virginia, when an indentured laborer partnered with enslaved labor to work in such an environment that their lifespans were estimated to be less than 5 years upon setting foot on the continent. And these were conditions that were replicated in mining and railroad construction industries in the west of the United States. With the Chinese Exclusion Act, it was ensured that laborers were trapped and that their families could not join them. Viewed as perpetual foreigners, their numbers dwindled. Unlike that of African descended peoples of the United States, who were forced to reproduce their numbers during enslavement, and this is thanks to the outlawing of the slave trade in 1808, the Chinese were not able to grow their numbers. Imagery can still be found to this day of racialized caricatures of these Chinese immigrants. Propaganda scare tactics led to massacres of Chinese towns like those of contemporary wealthy African American towns. And this is a kind of a common thread throughout these different colonial stories is as colonizing empires make conditions worse in the areas where they're colonized, and they see a lot of immigration from those areas. The United States has seen it during our involvement with the Second Opium War, and then especially through the following centuries or following decades in China, we saw a lot more as we were getting more involved there. The same thing happened in the Philippines shortly after our conquest of the Philippines and our brutal repression of Philippine society and the construction of concentration camps there and all this horrible shit. We saw an influx of Filipino immigrants. And Filipino immigrants make up a very large portion of American society today, which it happened as well in other cultures. You'll see a lot of you'll see tons of South African, Nigerian, Jamaican people in Britain. In those different places that they had control over. You see Malian, Algerian, different African groups in France as well. Less so in Germany. They didn't have much, but they still exist. When you do this to those people, they're going to go to the heart of the empire once they are forcibly put into the empire to try and secure their own wealth. They're going to try and secure their own capital. They're trying to make their own ends meet. That's what most of this immigration occurs for. So we have this rough immigration experience with the people of China here in the United States, okay, and it's driven by the expansions of empire. So where does that really start with our modern xenophobia campaign? Okay, so this most of it had to start with the whole Free Tibet thing in the 60s and 70s, and there's all sorts of declassified Central Intelligence documents, State Department documents about why they pushed for the Free Tibet thing. Tibet, for those that you aren't aware, was invaded by the PLA or the PRC with the PLA. PRC used the PLA; it was their army. They invaded them in 1951. The Dalai Lama, he fled into northern, either India, Nepal, so right across the Himalayas, right on the other side of them. And so they invaded them, and they began a modernization campaign there, just the same as they did everywhere else. I'm not going to go into the specifics of it, but that's what happened. So the United States government pushed the whole Free Tibet thing to say, oh, they're being all this despotic, and without ever taking into account what the Tibetan people wanted, and most of them voted to stay with the PRC. And you can say, oh, it was a democratic election, whatever. You weren't there. Okay, so this period saw the ever since the Free Tibet thing in the 60s, we've heard all these stories about China, about how terrible it is. There's the violence of the Cultural Revolution, and tens of millions are starving and being executed intentionally, and then millions are filling mass graves across the country. We heard about tanks crushing babies at the Tiananmen Square in '89. The the Chinese Navy were unreasonably buzzing close to our heroic sailors in the South China Sea. They're downing our heroic aviators for having the audacity to spy over Hainan. They had the audacity to place their country along the borders of all these places where the U.S. absolutely has a reason to be, like Korea and Vietnam and Pakistan and Afghanistan. They're violently suppressing these protesters in Hong Kong. How dare they? They're daring to oppose Hong Kong being a part of China rather than I don't know, an independent city or returning to the crown. Right? They're conducting a latter-day Holocaust in Xinjiang, and they've murdered over 1.5 million of the Uyghur population out of the 11 million Uyghurs that live in Xinjiang, and even forcing them to stay quiet about that. And the fact that then they're forcing them to celebrate Eid at gunpoint. They're daring to assist with infrastructure construction throughout the entirety of Asia in the Belt and Road Initiative. They're obviously a neo-colonial plot to dominate those countries by providing $8 trillion worth of funding to over 60% of the world's population. So these events, if you take them at face value, for the screed I just did right there, that portion, that was not a serious portrayal of events, for those disclaimer. So if you take them at face value, they paint China out to be an incredibly negative place. They're obviously negative, right? It's terrible. What's the purpose of these stories, though? You got to look. So you look at the sources of them, obviously, throughout the years, and they're either generally from Western governments. Okay, where was I? I'm getting distracted by a kitty cat. So it doesn't mean that they weren't fighting prior to the Marxist-Leninism, though. The rise of Marxist-Leninism, though. Just because some people became communists doesn't mean they suddenly realized that imperialism was bad. People have known that for ever since imperialism was a thing. They knew it when they were facing down Roman armies marching through their streets, right? So the ever-present fear of invading Asiatic hordes is a fear that harkens back to historical examples of Hunnic invaders, Mongol invaders, Ottoman invaders, and is a fear that was stoked by such illustrious characters as Winston Churchill and Adolf Hitler. And as a side note there, about Adolf Hitler, and I've talked about the Germans a lot, weirdly, for an episode about China. Much of the indoctrination that the Wehrmacht recruits underwent during the 1930s focused on dehumanizing everybody east of the Oder River, painting them as a literal Asiatic horde in the model of Mongol armies that invaded Europe 700 years before. This was like burned into their brains just as much as during the past 2 decades in the United States, we were in the military, we were told like, oh, the Arabs, the Muslims, oh yeah. They put a nice face on it, but the conversation centers around that. It dehumanizes and alienates the supposed enemy. Okay, that's the whole point of it. Makes it easier for you to go over there and do unhuman things to them. So this dehumanization of the peoples of Asia is a common trope in Western societies, and it's one that has little respect for even the basic ethnic differences of any of their great numbers. They're all the same. They all look like Genghis Khan, okay? And they're all coming to eat everybody here. So as with most things, it comes down to money, especially when dealing with the power dynamics under capitalism. The best way that I've heard it described in the modern era is like as a poker game, with China slowly getting a better hand. The United States has gained a series of cards over the nascent socialist state in China with their victory during the Second World War and their backing of the Kuomintang government, providing a foothold in both South Korea and a bulwark in Taiwan. Other colonial possessions, such as a British colony in Hong Kong, would come to prominence as China's relative power skyrocketed. These regions, including that in Tibet and the accusations of genocide in Xinjiang, pose challenges to who controls the financial prospects of China. The entire intent of these counterplays in the Western hand of cards is to damage the industries in China while extracting whatever they can from them, targeting their production of things such as solar panels and cotton, which have both skyrocketed during the course of the past couple of decades. And with the expansion of China's Belt and Road Initiative, the rapid modernization of the People's Liberation Army, Navy, and Air Force, and their position as the world's largest economy, Western powers are freaking the fuck out. They are freaking out and pumping out propaganda in an effort to prime their citizens for conflict. Now, here's a news article every day about some atrocity committed by their government, usually sourced from the CIA front of Radio Free Asia or the clearly impartial Adrian Zenz, or any of their successes are painted as an obvious threat to American supremacy. I was listening to NPR this morning, those nice, polite Republicans, and they were even talking about how Biden was meeting with China to say, like, we want to de-escalate and make sure there's not a military conflict between us And it's like, well, yeah, if we didn't have boats 6,000 miles away off their coast, there probably wouldn't be a military conflict, wouldn't be a reason to get into a fight. So China's correct in having a healthy distrust of American foreign policy initiatives. I think anybody with half a working brain can look at the past 70 years and say, yeah, you don't trust the Americans. We've never maintained treaties on an equal level with any party that we've ever made them. We waged wars of interventions along every side of the border of their borders. Russia in 1919, Korea 1950 to 1953, Vietnam from 54 to 74, and Afghanistan from 2001 to 2021, all around China. Generally to combat communism, but mostly in an effort to maintain American hegemony. We have regular war games where the enemy is a near-peer adversary. And for those that don't know, a near-peer adversary is someone with capabilities and weapons on par with the United States, as opposed to fighting a counterinsurgency campaign, which is what we had done for, like, the bulk of my military training when I was in, from 2007 to 2013, was focused on counterinsurgency work, because that was the prime of our counterinsurgency time. During my period of time in from 2017 to 2020, it was all near-peer adversary. We were all focused on fighting tank battles, which that's a whole nother story. I got to do a whole set on my my military experiences. They're fun times. Anyways, so these near-peer adversaries are usually mocked up as the old Soviet Union, but increasingly they're modeled after the PLA. And we do this and at the same time decry them for daring to practice aerial bombardment of a mock-up of our aircraft carriers. This double standard is in everything we do with our dealings with China, just as it has been with our dealings with literally every other nation on Earth. The United States has displayed time and time again that it will not act in goodwill and have some sort of ulterior motive, especially when it comes to socialist states. And that's with reason, because we view socialist states as an existential threat to what we are protecting, which is capitalism. So in conclusion, while China is most certainly not perfect and may not be everyone's example of a perfect socialist state, they are at the very least attempting to advance the cause for communism. And they are justified in defending themselves against Western interference, and especially from Western judgment. That's why I won't have anything really critical to say of China. And I'll go links to slap down any CIA backlie that I hear about them. Okay, they're moving towards communism even if they're not perfect, and they make mistakes because that's what human beings do. Okay, and they make mistakes. They may even act in evil manners. Oh, I don't want to say evil manners, but in not the most respectful manners of human rights or liberties or whatever. But I'm not going to decry them for daring to stand up against an empire that spans the globe. I can't decry any people that stand up against an empire that spans across the globe. Okay, taken in a vacuum, I can find plenty of things to decry people for. But on that point of standing up against Western imperialism, I don't see how anybody can have a foot to stand against that. And don't get me started on the entire Xinjiang thing. Okay, if you believe a single word from far right, born again, evangelical assholes, someone who was sent on a mission from God against China with the very fine scholarly credentials as a theologian, there are the network of Chinese human rights defenders, which is a U.S. government-sponsored organization with incredibly shitty research methods. I don't know what to tell you. Okay, you may disagree with the Chinese government's methodology for combating terrorism, okay, via social methods within their own territory. However, I find it to be slightly more palatable than the American response to 9/11 and ongoing imperialist efforts throughout the global South in the name of counterterrorism. But that's another episode for another time. I'm not going to linger on it too long. Okay, I'm going to say, suffice to say, is that the purpose of this wash of propaganda that we're seeing, and it is just an absolute unending torrent, it comes from the United States government, and as a part of a larger, Western collective empire, whatchamacallit, all the capitalist systems. It's directed at them for being a successful socialist state. It's projected at them because of how they're combating Western imperialism throughout the globe. They're pushing back in a very hard manner. They are outspending us in infrastructure projects across the planet. And this, you see this rise of a Cold War, a second Cold War between the United States and China, and it's for a reason. And it's not because China's trying to drive a Cold War. I mean, how much harm is a railway going to do? Okay, now they're extracting resources. They're having trade with these people, sure, for certain. But does that mean that they're trying to take over the world? They're trying to press friendly ideals. They're trying to press their ideology, sure. Is that somehow less preferable to death squads and bombing campaigns? I think it is, and they're outspending the United States heavily on this subject. And it almost reminds me of kind of like an inverse of what happened during the 1980s with the dawn of the Star Wars initiative, which ostensibly was to just ramp up military spending and in-debt spending because the United States could afford it at the time. It was a prosperous time for the United States, whereas the Soviet Union was going through several economic crises at the period. They're going through economic and political socio crisis, which would lead to their downfall in 1991. I almost see it flipping there, but thankfully, China's doing all this exorbitant spending on things that help people, as opposed to what we were spending it on, which was which was Star Wars, building space lasers. Very very good use of human capital and human ideology or human welfare. Very good way to spend the time. So that's about the end of my spit here. I know I'm running long. I'm gonna have to pare down a little bit out of this, but I'm glad to be getting back into this, and I want to start doing. So there's always going to be current event topics for me to talk about, and I'm gonna keep talking about whatever's going on. I've got another couple in the pipe over the next few weeks that I'm going to be accomplishing. But I've also got to start doing some educational material, and I want to keep those down to like 5 to 10 minutes, so not as long as me ranting like this. Just something more that people can use as a resource to share when somebody asks a question about what something is. I can give kind of an easy breakdown that you can just watch real quick on your phone, or you can pull up real quick at the work computer, you know, when you're studying communism instead of working. Yeah, so that's gonna be my goal. I'm not sure what I'm gonna get like 4 or 5 lined up in little scripts right now. Probably only 500, maybe 1,000 words. Like I can bust that out in about 10 minutes maybe. So yeah, that's what's on the plate coming up here, and I'm gonna be trying to build this channel up more and more and more. It's gonna take me a while because I've got to build it up while also doing real life work and real life organizing. So it's all a long-term process, but nothing happens overnight. So I want to thank you for watching. I want to thank you for joining me today on this beautiful snowy day. We just got snow here, so it's great. I'm going out crunching my toes in it. Threw Angus in it. He sprinted to the hills. Yeah, so I will see you all for the next one. Peace and solidarity.